So I've grown increasingly interested in the U.S. and its pretty much eventual default on its debt. It's kind of interesting, like looking back at history. And the first thing that I find interesting is the history of world reserve currencies. So there's kind of been a progression of countries, and it goes from Portugal to Spain, to the Netherlands, to France, to Britain, um, and then finally to the United States. And I think it's kind of foolish to think that the United States is indefinitely going to maintain reserve currency status. I think it's kind of just a matter of time. And I guess relative to all those other currency regimes, they lasted for about 100 years. And that's kind of where we're roughly at. So that's kind of interesting, just how the cycles of debt kind of build over generations and people kind of like historically act similar in certain circumstances. And you get this like similar events kind of like compounding over time. Um, Another thing I find interesting is that it says, very few countries have maintained a perfect record of never defaulting on their sovereign debt throughout their entire history. So currently, it looks like Norway, Canada, New Zealand, Singapore, and Switzerland are the only kind of countries that have never defaulted on their debt. I would kind of argue too that that's just basically they haven't been given enough time, or that they're kind of smaller financial hubs. I think almost inevitably, if a country becomes the reserve currency, they need to keep issuing that currency so the rest of the world can use it. So it kind of almost makes it inevitable that they accumulate more debt, and just having the reserve currency gives them an unfair advantage in borrowing more than they should probably be borrowing to fund wars and other crazy programs that they probably really shouldn't be funding if they were in like a normal debt market. Which kind of brings us to the U.S. and it's like, well, when's the U.S. going to default? And I found an interesting article on the Hill that says that the U.S. kind of technically has already defaulted four times. The first being in 1862, the U.S. government defaulted on some Civil War payments. And the second being in 1933, an overt default by the U.S. government on its gold bonds. The third being in 1968, the government refused to honor explicit promise to redeem its silver certificate paper dollars for silver dollars. And the fourth and final being in 1971, when the U.S. broke foreign governments' ability to redeem dollars for gold under the Bretton Woods Agreement. So I guess just taking all that into account and thinking about where we're at now and how quickly the debt's compounding, I think it's wise to consider what the inevitable next U.S. debt default will look like, or restructuring, and how that will affect your finances. I think some kind of takeaways are maybe to have a little more international exposure, a little more commodity exposure, just in the event that there is defaults, devaluations, things like that. So, yeah, I don't know. Just food for thought. Just because something takes a long time doesn't mean it's not going to happen. I think it's essentially inevitable. I know people have been talking about the U.S. debt and default for a long time now, but I think we're kind of in the end game here. So I wouldn't be surprised if in the next 15 years, 10, 15 years, maybe sooner, we're finally going to have to pay the bill for the past 40 years plus of, just debt accumulation. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. What your plans are, how you think about that, structuring your portfolio. let me know and I'll talk to you later. Thanks. Bye.